Can you see my screen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much to Luohan Academy for inviting me to present. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to join this group of very distinguished scholars, some of which are very good friends, to discuss the issues of platform responsibility. It's also a bit scary, by the way, to have as a commentator Eric Maskin, but that's another issue. Now, what? Oh, sorry. I'm having a problem going from one slide to the next. Okay. What I'd like to do is to focus on two ambiguities in the discussion, and that's why I added regulators in the title. The first ambiguity is that there are lots of the problem of the definition of responsibility. There are lots of definitions of responsibility, and they don't all mean the same thing. For instance, I'm responsible for the happiness of my hamster. Doesn't have the same responsibility, doesn't have the same meaning as in my responsibilities include cleaning the cage of my hamster. The second problem is that when we change the responsibilities of a platform, we also change the responsibilities of the regulators. And I don't think that we can discuss what are the responsibilities we should give to the platforms without discussing what are the responsibilities we give to the regulators. So I will discuss this in the context of a shift from a competition policy to ex-ante regulation, which is taking place all over the world. So, I mean, let me explain. The underlying premise of much of our discussions is that we want platforms to take more responsibility for the consequences of their actions. For instance, as we've discussed extensively, social networks should be more responsible for policing dangerous speech on their platforms. In that sentence, the responsibility has two meanings. The first one is that the social media has a duty to ensure that dangerous misinformation about drugs is not present on their platform, and they must deal with it. The second thing is that the second meaning is that social media will be heavily fined and will be punished if there are dangerous information on their platforms. And those two meanings are not quite similar. And in some sense, what Marshall was doing earlier was try to link those two definitions of responsibility, but we really need to be clear that they are different. The second problem is that the shift from a competition policy to regulation is going to means that the platforms are in some sense less responsible and the regulators are going to be more responsible. In particular, when you do competition policy, you announce some objectives and you tell the platforms try to get it, keep the markets pro-competitive, working in the service of consumers. On the other hand, when you go to regulation, the regulators tell the firms how do they need to reach this objective. So to a first approximation, the responsibility for choosing the means to attain the objective is transferred from the platform to the regulators. If I'm right, we need to face the consequences of doing this. In part, that requires us to think about the incentives of the regulators. Otherwise, the system which we design will not be sustainable. Sorry, my screen sharing is not great. So let me make this a little bit more personal. A few years ago, I was honored to be named special advisor to Commissioner Vestager, the European Competition Commissioner, with two of colleagues, Heike Schweitzer and Yves Alexandre de Montjoie. We were asked to think about the future of competition policy for the digital economy. We produced a report. The cover wasn't very distinguished in its design, but you see it. I think the report was quite good. And we surveyed the challenges that the digital economy race for competition policy, and we suggested a few reforms. For instance, we suggested that if a platform had a policy which impeded multi-homing, it would be a priori illegal, and the platform would have a burden of proof of proving that this practice was pro-competitive, good for the consumers. Now, I enjoyed writing the report. Some people said nice things about it. It gets me invited to panels such as this one. But as far as I know, none of the proposal was implemented by the EU. Instead, if you allow me a little bit of some exaggeration, the EU decided to switch from competition policy to regulation, at least as far as the digital economy is concerned. It's a caricature, okay? And this is a genesis of the Digital Market Act, which passed in 2022 and which is beginning to have its effects now. Now, I console myself by saying that maybe our report was so good that it convinced the Commission that it was impossible to reform competition policy and that we are responsible for the DMA. Tommaso Valetti is speaking just after me, and is forbidden to say that I'm wrong on this point. So to give you an example of consequences, the European Commission had begun proceedings against Amazon for a certain number of its practices. One of the cases were raised on the fact that Amazon, as a seller, was using the data it acquired about its competitors when it was acting as a marketplace in order to help design its product, estimate demand, and so on. The EU had begun a competition policy case against it. That practice is forbidden by the DMA, and which means that Amazon has settled the competition policy case, but clearly we've gone there from competition to regulation. To go a little bit further in our discussion, it might be worthwhile to have a caricatural model of competition policy. Okay? Basically, on competition policy, you've got some things you are always allowed to do. For instance, you can always develop a new technology as long as you respect the intellectual rights of others. There are some things which you're absolutely never allowed to do. For instance, you are never allowed to discuss prices with your competitors. And there are some things which you are allowed to do unless the competition authorities can prove that they're bad for the consumers. And for this last point, let me take an example, which is not properly speaking about platforms, but I think it's a very clear-cut example, and it affects some platform. The FTC has just proposed a rule that would make non-compete clauses in employment contracts illegal. Now, those are clauses which forbids an employee to get a job in a competitor after they've resigned from their employer. I think the very vast majority of economists would agree that there are circumstances where non-compete clauses are perfectly appropriate. Okay, so how would we defend the FTC proposal? Well, I think we would defend the FTC proposal as saying it's too complicated to write a rule which accepts appropriate and to enforce rules which accept appropriate non-compete clauses, and hence we're going to do something which is cheaper, which is just ban them all the way. Of course, there are errors here. The basic idea is that it's being too lenient is more costly than being too strict. And this example shows us that regulation works on a very different way. Basically, regulation says you can do this, you cannot do that. Now, of course, regulation has always existed in some dimensions. Okay? What the current movement is doing is transferring some practices from the competition policy angle to the regulation model. And and of course, full treatment will be much more complicated. The point I want to stress is that the regulations shift responsibilities from the firms to the regulators. And in particular, if a non-compete ban is implemented, the FTC will become responsible for its consequences, and in particular, if a rule is badly written, it will be the FTC's responsibility, as opposed to what you could do, which is treat it under competition law or another type of law where you would give more responsibilities to the firm. So going back to the regulation of the big platforms, I will submit that there has not been enough discussions of the consequences of this shift in responsibilities. Sorry, let me. I apologize for my bad technology. Let me go through three consequences. But before beginning, I want to stress that I'm generally in favor of that shift from competition policy to regulation. And I really support the regulators who are trying to do this in an intelligent way. But I think that we do them a disservice if we don't help them implement this shift in regulation in a way which is appropriate and intelligent and balanced. The first point I think is very important is that the regulator must take responsibility for the failures of a regulation, and the systems must induce the regulator to do this, and they're bound to be some, and they should be able to correct them. And there's the GDPR, the European Data Protection Act, provides a cautionary tool in that regard. Many observers, and not only the nasty advocates of platforms or the free market fanatics, have criticized some of the aspects of the GDPR, but the European regulators have been more than reluctant to review it or even to discuss those criticisms. In the case of the Digital Market Act, there are only 2 articles, 19 and 53, which deal with evaluation and evolution of a regulation, and I find them rather weak. For instance, Article 53 calls for a regular evaluation of a DMA, but it's supposed to be done by the Commission itself. The second point is that the regulator has a responsibility to make regulations that are clear and unambiguous. And that's easy to say. It's sometimes very difficult in the political process to do this. But if we take Article 6.4 of the DMA, which you have on the screen, and it takes aim at the app stores of Apple and Android, the gatekeeper shall allow and technically enable the installation and effective use of third-party software application. So this means sideloading, or software application stores or competing application store. And there's a real problem to know whether the or means that the third parties are able to do, whether the Apple is going to be forced to allow both safe loading and another app store, or one or the other. And actually the German text says and at this point, and all the legal texts are the same. So there's a real problem of doing regulations which are clear. And again, when they go through the political process, it's very hard to do it, because one easy thing to do is to hide the political disagreements and in unclear regulation. Finally, the responsibility should be clearly allocated. And if we look at the Article 8.1 of the DMA, says first the gatekeeper shall ensure compliance with the obligations of the regulation. And it also, the second sentence, also notice, says the gatekeeper shall do that in a way where it makes sure that it's effective in achieving the objectives of its regulation. The second sentence is very problematic. Okay, first, the objectives of a DMA are fairness and contestability of markets, and those are defined only in a very cursory way in the regulation, so it's not entirely clear what they mean. And secondly, what happens if a regulation is badly drawn and doesn't, goes against contestability? How can you make the firms responsible for doing something with the regulation is preventing them to do. So there's a real problem of making sure that the responsibility are clearly allocated. Okay. Again, I want to stress that those are criticism of specific points, more for illustrative purposes. Overall, I think the DMA is a pretty good first step, and I support it. So as a conclusion, I think that the regulatory shift that we see all over the world transfers responsibility from the gatekeepers to the regulators. And we shouldn't say just that it increases that it changes the responsibilities of the gatekeepers. We should also look at the other side of the medal. We've done very, very little work in recent years on the economics of the regulatory system by itself, and particularly economists should do much more in order to help design the regulations and balance those responsibilities. Okay. Again, I presented some very preliminary ideas. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Jacques,